No generation can choose the age or circumstance in which it is born, but through leadership, it can choose to make the age in which it is born an age of enlightenment, an age of jobs and peace and justice.
The election is over. Ronald Reagan is still president. We'll never know if the Democrats nominated the right person, but we do know that the 1984 Democratic National Convention changed the face of American politics. For a brief moment, people who worked within the Rainbow Coalition felt the excitement of seeing their candidate, Jesse Jackson, a possible nominee for the President of the United States. Whether or not that was in fact a possibility is not the issue. The issue is the movement and the process of the Rainbow Coalition and the Jackson campaign.
They said that it couldn't be done, but he did it. They thought it was in a cocoon. They said he was dead, but we know in due season the cocoon broke open and Jesse emerged with the colors of the rainbow.
Today we are gathered to explore an historic event, the impact of the Reverend Jesse Jackson's candidacy for President of the United States. Jackson's candidacy not only demonstrates the achievement of new levels of unity and synthesis by the black electorate, but it also puts the question to white America, are you ready to deal with Afro-American politicians as peers, not surrogates? The ramifications of the Jackson campaign are vast, extending into the areas of domestic policy, defense spending, foreign policy, race relations, religion, and culture. Reverend Jackson's candidacy emerges in direct relationship to the national and international crises of political leadership in the United States. The growing struggle of third world countries to free themselves from the dominance and exploitation of this system constitute one facet of this crisis. The struggle of blacks, browns, Asians, Native Americans against racism, and the movement for gender equality are still other aspects of this crisis. The campaign of Jackson has not only identified this crisis, it has embodied it and become its epiphany. Like a whirlwind, this struggle has moved over different parts of our globe in the last decades. Vietnam, Angola, Zimbabwe, Lebanon, Miami, Nicaragua. And for the past several months, its eye has been the U.S. and its voice, Jesse Jackson's.
The black middle class was in the main opposed to Jesse Jackson. Not because of the fact that they'd known the man, but because he didn't speak like us. He didn't talk like us. You know, he didn't act like us. He was, after all, sort of a black Baptist preacher. I sensed at that moment that what we really had was a class phenomenon. Now, having sort of built that, I would just like to make a couple of comments about the campaign. In 1976, black people felt in the leadership that they had played an inordinate role in the election of Jimmy Carter as president. 8 months later, Vernon Jordan, who was then the president of the Urban League, was suggesting that blacks didn't get anything for having played such a profound role in the campaign. In 1982, if one looks at the statistics in the off-year congressional elections, you begin to see a very interesting fact, and that is blacks began to turn out and vote in very heavy numbers. I think that that is the first indication that we have that blacks are beginning to respond to the Reagan phenomenon in the electoral institution. And then finally, of course, there was the question of Harold Washington's election in Chicago. I would say that that election really was the last factor that sort of stimulated this drive for a black presidential candidacy. It provided the environment within which Walter Mondale and Ted Kennedy would come into Chicago and endorse everyone but Harold Washington. And that snub said to black political leaders that this is likely to be the scenario in 1984 if we don't do something about it. And so These four sources, I think, I would commend to you as the way in which the presidential candidacy of Jesse Jackson came into being. Immediately it came into being, there was a question of Jesse Jackson's credibility. Was Jesse Jackson the right man? The summer debates of 1983 were essentially wrapped up in that question. Is he qualified? Will he sell us out? What about his past? He has not been known to stick to this, that, or the other. Can he really do the job? Does he have the money? He is inexperienced as a politician. All of these were questions of credibility. I submit that the candidacy of Jesse Jackson, with regard to this question of qualifications in particular, as part of the general package of credibility questions, has been answered. And that it has opened up a more profound discussion of what it means to be qualified to run for the presidency of the United States. There is the assumption that if only you have the experience of a congressperson or having been a senator, then ipso facto one is qualified to be president of the United States. I submit to you that that is a very narrow experience, that you could have been a congressperson or you could have been a senator and know nothing about America, nothing about the world. And so when one looks at the experience of Jesse Jackson, here is someone who not only has negotiated with corporate boards, also been in the street, labor leaders, picket lines, and civil rights marches, someone who's known heads of state, someone who, in short, has had a tremendous breadth of experience, someone who, I submit, knew America better than his opponents, someone who certainly knows the third world better than his opponents, and who therefore was eminently more qualified by his breadth of experience to be president of the United States.
I learned more in this year about politics than I did in the previous 40 years of political experience. The fact is that the Jackson campaign is such a brilliant illumination of our experience that it really brings out things that we knew but never realized that we knew. If someone came down from Mars and looked at politics in the United States since World War II, they'd come to a very interesting conclusion. What they would see is, after World War II, wave after wave of popular progressive movements that arose not out of the political establishment, but just in the streets. The civil rights movement. As Jesse says, no party, no convention did what the march from Selma to Montgomery did. In any sensible society, those of us who achieved that would now be in political power. And you have to ask yourself, how come? How come the civil rights movement didn't result in a huge increase in the number of elected black officials? Because after all, in many ways, they led that movement. And everyone realizes it was in the national interest. The reason is that these movements stayed away from electoral politics. White progressives, largely white progressives, had created the peace movement, the environmental movement, and so on. And one of the things that has happened is that Jesse Jackson has achieved what no one has ever come close to doing, pulling all of these movements together around a central theme. And the remarkable thing that Jesse has done, and I've seen it happen over and over again, is that he talks to a group, understands where they're coming from, what their interest is, and then teaches them the link between their interest and everybody else's.
If blacks vote in great numbers, progressive whites win. It's the only way progressive whites win. If blacks vote in great numbers, Hispanics win. When blacks, Hispanics, and progressive whites vote, women win. When women win, children win. When women and children win, workers win. We must all come up together. We must come up together.
We don't have any rainbow except black and white because there's no sizable Hispanic population or Asian American. But we looked for the rainbow in different constituencies. You know, we went to the environmentalist groups, the elderly groups, the students, the peace groups, the white churches. We tried very consciously to reach out, and we did involve a lot of people who had not been involved in any kind of civil rights activity or people that you would naturally think would, you know, come out for Jesse Jackson. I worked particularly with other people to take the campaign into the white community.
Personally, I felt that I agreed the most with his platform overall, even beyond the Asian Pacific issues, that his stand in terms of civil rights and peace and justice was good for everybody, and therefore it was the best for Asian Americans. In terms of a campaign and getting involved in electoral politics for the first time, that his campaign was the most successful, the most grassroots, and I thought it was really exciting and something that I could really identify with. And I ran as a delegate in the 10th Congressional District, and I think almost everybody was doing that for the first time, and everyone learned at the same time. And you know, it was just that kind of access that I think Jackson's campaign has provided. And we asked him what his position was on redress and reparations for Japanese American community, what his position was on the Simpson-Mazzoli bill, which also affects the Asian community, on bilingual education, and he took the time to learn about the issue and take a very strong progressive stand, you know, for us, and put it on as part of his platform. And I think that's something that a major presidential candidate has never done before. And the other candidates were also approached in the same way, but the response just wasn't as wholehearted.
As the Asian Americans, we are so proud because we made history. This is the first year that so many Asian Americans voted because Jesse Jackson inspired us. We have been here for over 150 years. We have made a lot of contribution to building America, but we have experienced more than our share of rejection and exclusion. But Jesse Jackson opened the door for us. He welcomed us. He made us look like this is our home. We love him.
I tell people out here that I'm a product of affirmative action and a quota system. The black population in Kentucky is only 7%. But when we met in our congressional district caucus to elect delegates to San Francisco, we had won the majority. So we got 3. We were to have 3 out of the 5 delegates that this congressional district would send to San Francisco. Hart got 1, Mondale got 1, we got 3. So to me, it was a very significant thing, very moving thing, that when we got in the caucus meeting, there were about 120 delegates from the lower level to this meeting, and I would say, just guessing, probably 80% of them were black. The co-chairperson of the Jackson campaign got up and said that she thought that the 3rd place should go to the rainbow, should be a white person, you see. And that crowd, 80% black, voted unanimously to give one of those 3 seats to a white person. Now, you got to understand that's a tremendously significant thing, because blacks have been so shut out of this process. Very few black people have had an opportunity to go to a national political convention. Here you had an opportunity for 3 people to go, and they gave up one of those seats because the only way I can figure, because they believe in the rainbow.
You don't create a coalition by saying, here's A, B, C, D, let's all get together. What you do is start with a theme. And this theme comes out of the black experience. And therefore, the rainbow begins with blacks and is led by blacks. and you must understand that we need to look at the problems in the country through the eyes of the poor and the disenfranchised. We have to see the country through the black experience, not for the sake of the improvement of the black situation, but for the sake of improving the country as a whole. And he has done that, of course, brilliantly, showing the link between national issues and what blacks need for themselves.
Our foreign policy must be characterized by mutual respect, not by gunboat diplomacy, big stick diplomacy, and threats. Our nation at its best feeds the hungry. Our nation at its worst, will mine the harbors of Nicaragua. At its worst, will try to overthrow that government. At its worst, will cut aid to American education and increase aid to El Salvador. At its worst, our nation will have partnership with South Africa. That's a moral disgrace. It's a moral disgrace. It's a moral disgrace.
Well, actually, I've been saying for several years now that there are more people alienated from the American values, the American society, the American economic and political approach than at any time in my life, and that includes the Great Depression of the 30s when I was cutting my teeth as a potential radical or an activist. I mean, I was ashamed for George McGovern today, hearing him speak up there, and it made me think of how weak he was in '72 compared to Jackson today. I mean, to get up there in this day and age and talk about the freeze and not talk about Central America, not talk about, the minority planks that the Jackson campaign, the Rainbow Coalition have put in. And I guess what I'm really getting at is that whatever good ideas and some degree of courage that both McCarthy and McGovern showed, they were not activists within a movement, and Jesse Jackson has been and is an activist within a movement.
20 years ago, our young people were dying in a war for which they could not even vote. 20 years later, young America has the power to stop a war in Central America and the responsibility to vote in great numbers.
There's only two ways, in my view, that you can gain power in America. One is that through economic, through the economy, through economics. The other one is through politics. And I think that the one way that blacks in our society can really take its piece of this land is through elective office. And people who can determine that are black folks themselves. If black folks vote in large numbers, they then control basically and essentially what happens within their city, within their state, and within this country. I think that Walter Mondale broke down a lot of barriers. He interviewed for the first time, in a serious way, two black men for the office of vice president, Tom Bradley and myself. He interviewed women for the first time. I know there were no black women involved in that, but the fact that we had blacks and females involved, in my view, broke down barriers. The fact that he asked this convention to nominate a woman for vice president is very significant and very important.
I think that Jesse Jackson has brought about the kind of changes in this country that forced the Democratic Party to bring into the party a female. And the female indicated that it had removed the sign from the door of that position from all white males to a female, but it does not remove the sign on the door from all whites only. I don't think the people on the street registered to vote for a white female for vice president. They registered to vote for Jesse Jackson as the president of this country.
Well, I think that blacks will leave here as a participant in a process in a different kind of way. And I think that the fact that the affirmative action minority plank was passed by unanimous vote is progress. On dual primaries, it was my feeling that it should have passed. I did not have to go through two primaries. If Harold Washington had to do so, he would not be mayor of Chicago now. If the governor of my state had to do so, he would not be governor now. And therefore, because I do not have it in my state and in my city, I don't think any state ought to have it. And it serves no purpose in my view. And I believe it does discriminate. I don't think anyone came in here winning and anyone came losing. I think that Mundell gave something, Jackson gave something, Hart gave something, and what came out of that was a fusion of the three candidates.
The convention is not over. And our agenda is not fulfilled. The convention is a comma. We pause here to move on. This is not a period. It does not stop our drive to change and for liberation. We must get all that we can get from the Democratic Convention.
Everyone from the constituency that the Democrats are working with got something. The women got something in the sense of Ferraro. Labor got its concessions. There was even a little touch of detente for people who wanted to normalize relations with the Soviet Union. There was a commitment to ending the war in Central America, this in the Mondale speech, but nothing for the black movement, even though that was the galvanizing force for all the other issues that were conceded upon.
I think that many people are like I am. I'm 61 years old. I've been a long-time Democrat, and I'm sick and tired. And a few years ago, I decided to make a change. I'm still a registered Democrat, but I'm voting an independent ticket. I think, if anything, I would like my grandchildren to know that I fought for change. These days that I've been at the convention, and I've been on the floor every day of the convention, I found more and more people who are disenchanted, who are cynical. And I think the campaign of Jesse Jackson was one that got people to vote, people who had not voted for years, young people who had not even bothered to vote when they became of age, registered and voted. I worked on the polls in New York City that day. I opened the polls and closed the poll, and I saw old people, people in wheelchairs, blind people who came out that Jesse Jackson and his candidacy had inspired to come out and try again. And I feel that people are not willing to settle for the Rainbow Coalition going into the hands of the Democratic Party. Well, if I vote this independent ticket, you know, won't that be making sure that Reagan gets in? My answer is that Reaganomics existed under Carter and before, and Reaganomics will exist under Mondale. Reaganomics is just a term that's been used for what our country has come to.
But the question is for the Democratic Party in this context to accept critical mass and accept the vision of the Rainbow Coalition. As I said, it is becoming increasingly a centrist party and a Republican clone. I mean, you cannot tell the difference between the men in the blue serge suits in the Democratic Party and the ones in the blue serge suits in the Republican Party.
As I've said, this day marks the end of a significant chapter in the history of black politics and also American politics. And the juxtaposition of those two really is amazing. I think in that juxtaposition we see a tremendous saga of what this particular campaign has meant. The first phase of this campaign is a campaign to establish the right of people to use the electoral arena as an instrument for social struggle. And therefore, a process of empowering the black community to do that. And many people in the black community who have been without voice and without such an instrument. And then the later stage, of course, was the stage of connecting that tremendous dynamism to the Rainbow Coalition. Simply mention that he was the one, through the debates, who brought South Africa into the picture. that he was the one who brought cutting the military budget by 20 to 25%, that he was the one who brought the question of the Middle East squarely into the picture. Of historic proportions. When you listen to him, he said one of the things that he is most profoundly concerned about and proud of is the opportunity to have brought Arabs out of their pariah status into the communion of American citizens and into the political process. And from that basis to begin to talk about what a just policy in the Middle East might look like. And of course, issues of civil rights, issues that we thought have been dealt with, runoff primaries, at-large, gerrymandering, all of those impediments that have kept people not only from voting, but have kept people from having the impact of their vote fully registered in the political process. We're still dealing on an unfinished agenda of civil rights.
That leaders must be tough enough to fight, tender enough to cry, human enough to make mistakes, humble enough to admit them, strong enough to absorb the pain, and resilient enough to bounce back and keep on moving.